The coffee maker gurgled to life at 5:30, same as it had every morning for the past 3 years since Margaret died. Same blue ceramic mug with the chip on the handle that she'd refused to throw away. "It gives it character," she used to say, running her thumb over the rough edge like she was gentling a spooked horse. I sat at the kitchen table, watching the December darkness through windows that needed new weather stripping. The garage door hung slightly askew, another item on the list of things I kept meaning to fix but never quite got around to. Margaret would have had me out there with a screwdriver by now, muttering about how a house reflects the man who keeps it. The phone rang just as I was settling into the morning quiet. David's name on the caller ID made my chest tighten in that way it had learned to do over the past year, ever since the conversations started feeling more like business meetings than father-son talks. "Morning, Dad." His voice carried that brisk efficiency he'd picked up somewhere between college and the consulting job that paid for the house I'd never been invited to see. "Morning, son. Listen, I wanted to run something by you about Christmas dinner. Jennifer's family is driving up from Cincinnati, and her mother has some ideas about making things more organized." I set the mug down carefully. Jennifer's mother, Patricia, a woman who smiled with her mouth but never her eyes, who had opinions about everything from my choice of dinner wine to the way I folded napkins. The kind of person who said, "Bless your heart," like it was a medical diagnosis. What kind of organized? Just some efficiency improvements. You know how holiday meals can get chaotic. Maybe we could handle the cooking at our place this year, keep things streamlined. Streamlined. As if the Christmas dinners Margaret and I had hosted for 32 years had been some kind of logistical nightmare, instead of the warm, slightly chaotic gatherings that had filled our dining room with laughter and the smell of her legendary apple stuffing. "I've got everything planned here," I said. "Turkey's already ordered. Margaret's recipes, Dad." His voice softened in that particular way that made my jaw clench. "I know Mom's traditions mean a lot to you, but maybe it's time to start some new ones. Jennifer's been researching smart home systems, and she thinks we could really modernize your setup, make things safer." Safer? There was that word again, the same one he'd used when suggesting I might want to consider updating my financial arrangements, when he'd mentioned that it might be prudent to add his name to certain accounts, just in case something happened. What's wrong with my setup? Nothing's wrong exactly. It's just that some of those old locks, the manual thermostat, technology has come so far. Jennifer found this smart lock system that can be programmed remotely, much more secure than traditional keys. I looked across the kitchen at the wooden key rack Margaret had made in her ceramics class. 3 hooks, house, garage, and the lake house key with its blue plastic head, worn smooth from 30 years of weekend escapes. Simple, reliable, mine. "I'll think about it." "Great. Oh, and Dad? We'll probably need to discuss some paperwork while everyone's together. Nothing urgent, just some organizational stuff, end-of-year planning." The line went quiet except for the sound of his breathing, and what might have been Jennifer's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out words. "What kind of paperwork?" "Just updating some documents, making sure everything's current. You know how these things work. Lawyers like everything neat and tidy." I didn't know how these things worked, actually. Margaret had handled most of our legal affairs, keeping files in the little oak cabinet beside her desk, everything labeled in her precise handwriting. After she died, I'd assumed everything was settled. The house was paid off. The will was filed. What else needed organizing? "I should probably go," David said. "Long day ahead, but I'm excited about Christmas. It'll be good to have everyone together." Everyone. His word choice sat uneasily in my chest as I hung up. When had our family Christmas become everyone? When had I become just another guest at a gathering that used to center around our table, our traditions, our home? I refilled my coffee and walked through the house, taking inventory the way a man does when he's trying to understand what he's looking at. The living room, with its stone fireplace, and the mantel where Margaret's collection of snow globes caught the early light. The dining room table, scarred from years of family dinners and homework sessions and the time David had tried to carve his initials into the wood when he was 8. In the hallway, our wedding photo hung beside a gallery of Christmas mornings. David at 3, grinning beside a bicycle that was too big for him. At 10, wearing the Cardinals jersey I'd surprised him with. At 16, trying to look too cool for family photos, but still standing close enough to his mother that their shoulders touched. I stopped at the last photo in the sequence, David at 25, Jennifer at his side, both of them holding champagne flutes at their engagement party. His smile was the same one I'd seen in every Christmas picture for 20 years, but something in his eyes had changed. There was a calculation there, a measuring quality that reminded me unsettlingly of Jennifer's mother. The garage was my refuge now, the way the garden had been Margaret's. Oil stains on the concrete floor told stories of every car I'd ever owned, every weekend project I'd tackled. My workbench held the same tools I'd been using for 30 years. Hammer with the worn hickory handle, the level that still ran true, coffee cans full of screws and washers sorted by size. On the wall above the bench, I'd mounted a shadow box containing Margaret's first attempt at woodworking, a small jewelry box with slightly crooked corners and a lid that never quite sat flush. She'd been so proud of it, insisted on giving it to her sister for Christmas, even though it was obviously a beginner's work. It's not about perfection, she'd told me. It's about making something with your hands, something that'll last. I thought about that now, about things that last and things that change, about the difference between improvement and replacement. The smart lock David had mentioned would certainly be more advanced than my simple deadbolt. But the deadbolt had never failed to keep out anything I wanted to keep out. It had never needed updating or programming or remote access. It just worked. The morning passed in the familiar rhythm of solitary tasks. I cleaned the coffee pot, straightened the already straight magazines on the end table, checked the oil in the truck, small acts of maintenance that felt like prayers to whatever gods watch over widowed men trying to keep their worlds intact. By afternoon, I was restless in the way that only comes from having too much time to think. I drove to the lake house, needing the 40-minute trip through bare December woods to clear my head. The place had been our escape for 15 years, a modest cabin on 8 acres of Missouri Lake country that Margaret had fallen in love with the first time we'd seen it. The key turned easily in the familiar lock. No smart technology required. Inside, dust motes danced in the pale sunlight that filtered through windows Margaret had hung with simple white curtains. Her reading chair still held the faint impression of her body, still faced the window with the best view of the water. I sat in my own chair, the leather worn to the exact shape of my shoulders, and looked out at the lake. Ice had formed along the edges, but the center still moved with the wind, dark water under a gray sky. This was where we'd planned to retire, where we'd imagined growing old together, watching seasons change through these windows, adding grandchildren to the gallery of Christmas photos. Instead, I sat alone, wondering when my son had stopped asking for my advice and started giving me instructions. When the boy who used to help me change oil in this same garage had become a man who thought my life needed managing. The truck radio played Christmas music on the drive home, Perry Como singing about chestnuts roasting on an open fire. Margaret used to sing along, slightly off-key but with enough enthusiasm to make up for it. Now the songs just reminded me of everything that had changed, everything that would never change back. That evening, I pulled out Margaret's recipe box and found the cards for Christmas dinner. Her handwriting covered index cards yellowed with age and splattered with decades of holiday cooking. Apple stuffing with sage, green bean casserole with the fried onions on top, bourbon sweet potatoes that David had loved since he was old enough to ask for seconds. I made a shopping list in my own careful print, planning a meal that would feed 8 people even though I wasn't sure who all of those people would be. Jennifer's family from Cincinnati, David and Jennifer, me. That made 6. Who were the other 2? The question bothered me more than it should have. In the old days, I would have called Margaret into the kitchen and asked her to explain the guest list, help me understand the social mathematics of holiday gatherings. She had a gift for managing people, for making everyone feel welcome without making anyone feel excluded. Now I was on my own, trying to decode conversations that seemed to have subtexts I couldn't quite grasp. End-of-year planning, organizational stuff, smart locks and streamlined dinners, and the careful way David had said everyone, like he was testing the word in his mouth. I closed the recipe box and put it back in its place beside the stove. Whatever was coming, whatever David and Jennifer had planned, I would be ready for it. This was still my house, still my Christmas, still my choice how to spend both. But as I turned off the kitchen light and headed upstairs to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in Cincinnati, Patricia was making her own lists. And unlike mine, hers probably didn't include recipes. The old house settled around me with its familiar creaks and sighs, the language of wood and metal adjusting to the December cold. In the darkness, I listened to the sounds of a home that had sheltered my family for 3 decades, that held 32 Christmases worth of memories in its walls. Whatever David's Christmas secret was, whatever paperwork he thought needed organizing, whatever smart technology he wanted to install, none of it would change the fundamental fact that this house belonged to me, that these traditions belonged to me, that the choice of how to honor Margaret's memory belonged to me. I fell asleep thinking about smart locks and wondering if my son had forgotten that I still had all the keys. Comment fair if you want the truth to be revealed. The call came 3 days before Christmas while I was stringing lights on the porch railing. Margaret had always insisted on the warm white ones, not the harsh blue-white LEDs that had taken over every other house in the neighborhood. Christmas should feel like candlelight, she used to say, not a hospital. Dad, small change of plans. David's voice had that rushed quality that meant he was multitasking, probably responding to emails while he talked. We're going to need to move Christmas dinner up a day. Jennifer's family has a scheduling conflict. I stopped mid-strand, a tangle of lights in my hands. Christmas Eve instead of Christmas Day? Right, hope that's not a problem. Actually, it might work out better. Gives everyone more flexibility for travel. Everyone. There was that word again. What about midnight service? Margaret and I had attended Christmas Eve service at St. Mark's for 28 years. It was one of the few traditions David had never questioned, even during his rebellious teenage years. Oh, a pause. Well, maybe we could do an earlier service, or skip it this year. Jennifer's family isn't really... They're more secular in their approach to the holidays. I wound the lights around the railing with more force than necessary. Since when do Jennifer's family's preferences dictate our Christmas traditions? Dad, come on, don't be like that. We're just trying to make everyone comfortable. There it was again. Everyone. As if I'd somehow stopped being part of the family equation and become an obstacle to be managed around. I'll think about it, I said, though we both knew what that meant. After I hung up, I drove to the lake house. I needed the quiet, the space to think without the weight of 30 years of family history pressing down on my shoulders. The December air was sharp enough to cut, and my breath fogged as I unlocked the cabin door. Inside, I made coffee and sat at the small kitchen table where Margaret used to do crossword puzzles while I read the paper. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust particles that danced like tiny spirits in the still air. I wasn't sure what I was looking for when I opened the file cabinet in the corner of the living room. Margaret had kept copies of important documents here: insurance papers, property deeds, tax records. Mostly I was just avoiding the house, avoiding the phone, avoiding the growing certainty that this Christmas was going to be different from all the others. But what I found made my coffee go cold in my mouth. The lake house deed was there, filed under property in Margaret's neat system. But clipped to it was a document I'd never seen before, a quitclaim deed form, partially filled out in handwriting I recognized. David's handwriting, my name listed as grantor, his name as grantee. The property description matching our lake house exactly. The form wasn't signed or notarized, just sitting there like a draft of something. A practice run. My hands weren't quite steady as I set the papers on the table. Beside them, I found a folder labeled Family Financial Planning. Also in David's handwriting, though I'd never authorized any family financial planning. Inside were photocopies of documents I'd never seen before. Bank statements for accounts that weren't mine. Loan applications with my name on them, and a printout of what looked like property values for both the house and the lake house. At the bottom of the stack was an email printed out on plain paper from Patricia, Jennifer's mother, to someone with the email address d.morrison.consulting@gmail.com, David's business email. David, it read, "Per our conversation, I've attached the documents you requested. The property consolidation makes sense from a tax perspective, and the timing works well with year-end planning. Jennifer mentioned you're still working on convincing him, but the smart home integration should help with the transition. Once the systems are in place, access controls become much more straightforward. Looking forward to finalizing everything over the holidays." P. I read it 3 times before the words fully sank in. Property consolidation, access controls. convincing him, meaning me. About what? The smart lock David had suggested suddenly took on a different meaning. Not security, control, remote access that would work both ways. Not just keeping people out, but potentially keeping people in. Or maybe just keeping track of who came and went and when. I walked to the window and stared out at the lake, trying to process what I'd found. The water was perfectly still, like a mirror reflecting the pale December sky. Margaret used to say that still water always looked peaceful from a distance, but you never knew what was moving underneath until you got close enough to see. The sound of gravel crunching in the driveway broke my reverie. Through the front window, I saw David's car pulling up beside my truck. My heart rate spiked as I quickly gathered the papers and shoved them back into the file cabinet. Whatever conversation was about to happen, I needed time to think before I revealed what I'd discovered. David knocked once and let himself in, something he'd done since he was old enough to reach the door handle. But today it felt different, like he was checking to make sure I was there rather than visiting to spend time with me. "Hey, Dad, thought I might find you here?" He glanced around the cabin, his eyes lingering on the file cabinet. "Everything okay? You seemed a little upset on the phone. Just needed some quiet to think." I gestured toward the kitchen. "Coffee's fresh if you want some." He shook his head, still standing near the door, like he might need to leave quickly. "Actually, I can't stay long. Jennifer's at the house setting up for tomorrow, and her parents should be arriving soon." Tomorrow, Christmas Eve dinner that I hadn't agreed to move. "About that?" I said carefully. "I'm not sure changing the date works for me. Midnight service has been important to your mother and me for a long time." David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Dad, Mom's not here anymore. Sometimes traditions need to evolve." The words hit like a physical blow. "That doesn't mean we throw them away. I'm not saying throw them away. I'm saying adapt them. Make them work for the family we have now, not the family we used to have. The family we have now." Another phrase that seemed to categorize me as past tense, a relic to be managed rather than a participant to be consulted. "What if I'm not ready to adapt?" I asked. David ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his childhood, when he was frustrated that his parents weren't understanding something he thought was obvious. "Look, Dad, I know change is hard, but some of the decisions you've been making lately, well, they're not practical. Living alone in that big house, driving out here by yourself, hanging on to all these old traditions when it's just you now, it's not sustainable." "What decisions?" The question came out sharper than I'd intended. "The financial stuff, not updating your estate planning, refusing to modernize basic security. Jennifer's mother knows people who can help with this kind of transition. It doesn't have to be traumatic." Transition. The word hung in the air like smoke from a fire. I couldn't see yet, but could smell getting closer. "What kind of transition?" David looked uncomfortable, glancing again at the file cabinet, then at his watch. "We can talk about it tomorrow, when everyone's together. It'll be easier to explain with all the paperwork." He moved toward the door, then stopped and turned back. "Dad, I want you to know this is all about taking care of you, making sure you're safe and secure. That's all any of us want." After he left, I sat in Margaret's chair and watched his taillights disappear through the trees. The cabin felt colder somehow, as if his visit had let in a draft that wouldn't quite close. I retrieved the papers from the file cabinet and spread them on the kitchen table. The quitclaim deed, the financial planning folder, Patricia's email about property consolidation and access controls. A picture was emerging piece by piece, like a jigsaw puzzle where I'd been assuming I was looking at sky when it was actually a storm cloud. My phone buzzed with a text message from a number I didn't recognize. Smart lock installation, scheduled for 12:24 at 10 p.m. Technician will arrive with programming equipment. Please have current keys available for system setup. I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it, but not before taking a screenshot. The drive home took me past the church where Margaret and I had been married, where we'd attended Christmas Eve services for nearly 3 decades. The marquee out front announced, "Christmas Eve service, 11 p.m., all welcome, all welcome." I wondered if that would still be true after tomorrow, after whatever David and Jennifer and Patricia had planned for Christmas Eve dinner. After the paperwork was explained and the transitions were proposed and the smart locks were installed at 10 o'clock, 2 hours before midnight service was scheduled to begin. The timing felt deliberate. Everything about this felt deliberate. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the truck for a moment, looking at my house. The warm light spilling from the windows I'd strung, the front door with its simple deadbolt that had never failed to keep out anything I wanted to keep out. The garage where my tools waited, organized and maintained and ready for whatever job needed doing. This was my house. These were my traditions. This was my life. But as I walked up the front steps, I couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow night, everything was going to change. And for the first time in 3 years, I found myself wishing Margaret was here, not just for the comfort of her presence, but for her sharp instincts about people. She would have seen this coming long before I did. She would have known what to do. Now I was on my own, with less than 24 hours to figure out what David's Christmas secret really was, and what I was going to do about it. Christmas Eve morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of heavy sky that promised snow but couldn't quite deliver. I woke at 5:30 out of habit, made coffee in the blue ceramic mug, and sat at the kitchen table planning my last day of normal, because that's what it felt like. The last day before, something fundamental shifted in my life. I could feel it in the careful way David had spoken about paperwork, in Patricia's email about property consolidation, in the smart lock installation scheduled for 10 o'clock tonight. Whatever they had planned, it was bigger than changing dinner from Christmas Day to Christmas Eve. I spent the morning doing ordinary things with extraordinary attention. I shaved with the same care I'd once reserved for job interviews. I polished my dress shoes, the black ones Margaret had bought me for David's wedding. I ironed a white shirt and laid out the navy tie she'd always said brought out my eyes. If I was walking into an ambush, I'd do it looking like the man I'd always been. At noon, I drove to David's house for the first time in 6 months. The development where he and Jennifer lived was the kind of place where every lawn was precisely edged and every mailbox matched the architectural guidelines. Their house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, all clean lines and neutral colors, with a 3-car garage that probably cost more than I'd paid for my entire house 30 years ago. Jennifer answered the door wearing a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Her smile was bright and practiced, the kind hostess is perfect for dinner parties where everything must go smoothly. "Richard, so glad you could make it." She kissed my cheek, leaving behind a faint scent of expensive perfume. Come in. Everyone's so excited to see you." Everyone turned out to be more people than I'd expected. Patricia sat in the living room's central chair like a queen holding court, wearing pearls and an expression of benevolent authority. Beside her, a man I didn't recognize, tall, silver-haired, wearing a suit that suggested either lawyer or banker. Jennifer's father had died 2 years ago. This wasn't him. "Dad, you remember my mother-in-law, Patricia," David said, appearing at my elbow with a glass of wine I hadn't asked for. "And this is Robert Caldwell, a family friend who's been helping us with some planning." Caldwell stood and offered his hand. His grip was firm, measured, the handshake of a man who spent his days convincing people to sign documents. "Pleasure to meet you, Richard. I've heard so much about you from David and Jennifer. What a lovely family you've raised." I accepted the wine, but didn't drink it. Something about the way Caldwell spoke, past tense, as if I'd finished raising my family and could now step back from active participation, set my teeth on edge. "And you are?" "Estate planning attorney. I've been helping David and Jennifer organize some financial matters. Nothing complicated, just good stewardship." Estate planning, for a 35-year-old man with no children and a wife who worked in marketing. I nodded politely and moved toward the dining room, where Jennifer was arranging place cards around a table set for 8. 8 people, David and Jennifer, Patricia and Caldwell. A couple I didn't recognize standing by the windows, looking out at the precisely landscaped backyard. And 2 place cards at the far end of the table, isolated from the main conversation, one with my name, one with Margaret. My chest tightened. "Jennifer, why is there a place card for Margaret?" She looked up from adjusting a napkin, her cheeks flushing slightly. "Oh, that. I thought, well, some families like to honor loved ones who've passed. I read about it in a magazine. It's supposed to be healing. Healing, or a reminder that I was the only one at this table who belonged to the old family, the family that was apparently being reorganized." "That's very thoughtful," I said, though it wasn't. It was manipulation, designed to make me emotional and compliant. Margaret would have seen right through it. David appeared beside me with his own wine glass, the kind of casual gesture that wasn't casual at all. "Dad, before dinner starts, maybe we could have that conversation I mentioned, about the paperwork." "What paperwork would that be?" He glanced toward the living room, where Caldwell was explaining something to Patricia in low, professional tones. "Just some updates to your estate planning. Nothing dramatic. Robert thinks it would be smart to modernize a few things, especially with the property values appreciating the way they have." Property values. The lake house I'd found on the quitclaim deed form. The house I was standing in, which had probably tripled in value since Margaret and I had bought it. "I haven't asked anyone to modernize anything." I know, but sometimes it's good to have a professional perspective. Robert's looked at your situation, and he thinks there are some opportunities to optimize. Optimize? As if my life was a business process that needed streamlining. The doorbell rang, saving me from having to respond. Jennifer hurried to answer it, returning with the couple I'd seen by the windows, her brother Mark and his wife Sarah, visiting from Columbus. More witnesses to whatever presentation was planned for dinner. We sat down to eat at 6:30. The meal was catered, I realized. Restaurant-quality food that hadn't been prepared in Jennifer's spotless kitchen. Prime rib, roasted vegetables, dinner rolls that had never seen a home oven. Nothing like the Christmas dinners Margaret had spent days preparing, filling our house with the smells of sage and cinnamon, and the particular chaos of love made edible. The conversation flowed around me like water around a stone. Patricia held court with stories about Christmas traditions in Cincinnati. Mark and Sarah talked about their children's school performances and vacation plans. Jennifer managed the meal service with the efficiency of someone who'd planned this evening down to the minute. And David watched me, waiting for something. The something came with dessert, store-bought cheesecake arranged on Margaret's good china, which I hadn't given them permission to use. "Richard," Caldwell said, setting down his coffee cup with deliberate precision, "David's told me so much about your property portfolio, the house, the lake house, really impressive assets for someone in your position. Someone in my position, widowed, aging, apparently in need of management." "They're not assets," I said carefully. "They're homes." Of course. Homes with significant financial value, though. And David's concerned about making sure that value is protected, optimized for the future. I looked at my son, who was studying his dessert plate like it contained the secrets of the universe. "What kind of optimization?" Patricia leaned forward, her pearls catching the candlelight. "Well, dear, at your age, managing multiple properties becomes quite a burden. The maintenance, the taxes, the insurance. It's so much responsibility for one person. At my age, I was 72, not 92. I still change my own oil, still climb ladders to clean gutters, still split my own firewood. I manage fine." "I'm sure you do," Caldwell said smoothly. "But wouldn't it be nice not to have someone you trust handle the details while you enjoy the benefits?" "What benefits?" David finally looked up. "Dad, what Robert's suggesting is a family trust. You'd still live in the house, still use the lake house. Nothing about your daily life would change, but the legal ownership would be structured more efficiently." "Efficiently? For whom? And the beneficiaries of this trust would be?" "Well, you, primarily, but also Jennifer and me, as your heirs. And, eventually—" He gestured vaguely toward the future, toward grandchildren who didn't exist yet. I set down my fork and looked around the table. 8 faces watching me, waiting for my response to a proposal I hadn't asked for, presented by a lawyer I'd never met, in a house that wasn't mine, using china that was. "When did you decide I needed my life reorganized?" "Dad, it's not reorganization, it's protection. What if something happened to you? What if you had another health episode like Mom did? Who would handle things?" Another health episode. Margaret's stroke had come without warning, taking her from perfectly healthy to gone in 6 hours. The implication was clear. I could be next, and when I was, they wanted the paperwork already in order. "I see." I stood slowly, folding my napkin and placing it beside my untouched dessert. "And the smart lock installation tonight? How does that fit into this protection plan?" David's face went carefully blank. Jennifer's fork clattered against her plate. Patricia's expression didn't change, but something sharp glittered behind her eyes. "How did you—" David caught himself. That's just a security upgrade for your safety. My safety. Or your access. The table went quiet except for the soft jazz playing through speakers I couldn't see. Mark and Sarah looked like they wished they were anywhere else. Jennifer studied her hands. Caldwell watched me with the professional interest of a man calculating odds. "Richard," Patricia said finally, her voice carrying the patient tone reserved for children and the mentally impaired. "I think you're misunderstanding the situation. We're all family here. Family takes care of family. Family asks permission before making decisions that affect other family members. Of course they do. That's why we're having this conversation. This isn't a conversation, it's a presentation. You've already made your decisions, hired your lawyer, scheduled your locksmith. You're not asking for my input, you're asking for my compliance." I walked to the living room and picked up my coat from the chair where Jennifer had carefully hung it. Behind me, I could hear urgent whispers, David's voice rising slightly above the others. "Dad, wait." He followed me to the front door. "You're overreacting. This is all about taking care of you." I turned to face him, this man who used to build blanket forts in my living room, who used to ask me to check for monsters under his bed, who used to think I could fix anything that was broken. "David, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I have taken care of myself for 72 years. I took care of your mother for 45 years. I built a business, raised a son, and maintained 2 homes without anyone's help. I don't need your protection, and I don't need your optimization. But what if nothing? This is my life. These are my decisions. And if you ever again schedule locksmiths or lawyers or family meetings about my affairs without my permission, you and I are going to have a very different kind of conversation." I opened the front door and stepped into the cold December air. Behind me, the warm light of David's house spilled onto the driveway, illuminating the perfect landscaping and the expensive cars and the life he'd built with his wife and her mother's money and advice. It was a beautiful life. It just wasn't mine. The drive home took me past St. Mark's, where the parking lot was already filling with cars for the 11 o'clock service. People coming together to celebrate something that couldn't be optimized or reorganized or managed by committee. Something that just was, because it had always been. Because some traditions mattered more than efficiency. At home, I sat in Margaret's chair and looked at our Christmas tree. Simple white lights and ornaments collected over 30 years of marriage. On the mantel, our wedding photo smiled down at me, Margaret's eyes bright with the kind of happiness that didn't require management. At 9:45, headlights swept across my front windows. A van with Smart Home Solutions painted on the side pulled into my driveway. I turned off all the lights and sat in the darkness, watching as a man with a toolbox approached my front door. He knocked twice, waited, then tried the doorbell. When I didn't answer, he pulled out his phone and made a call. Through the window, I could hear his side of the conversation. "No answer? Rescheduled? Yes, sir. I'll try back tomorrow." The van pulled away at 10:15. At 10:45, my phone rang. David's number. I let it go to voicemail. At 11 o'clock, I drove to church and took my usual seat in the third pew from the front, left side. The service was everything it had always been, candlelight and carols and the ancient story of hope arriving in darkness. When I got home at 1 in the morning, there was a note tucked under my door. David's handwriting. "Dad, we need to talk. The offer stands. D." I crumpled the note and dropped it in the kitchen trash. Then I made coffee in the blue ceramic mug and sat at the table where Margaret and I had planned 32 Christmases, thinking about what I was going to do next. Because one thing had become crystal clear during that dinner. This wasn't over. David and Jennifer and Patricia had invested too much planning, too much money, too many expectations to simply walk away because I'd said no. They would try again, and next time, they might not ask for permission at all. It was time to stop being defensive and start being strategic. Time to remember that I hadn't built a successful business and maintained a 45-year marriage by letting other people make my decisions for me. Time to remind my son that his old man still had a few moves left. Christmas Day dawned clear and bitter cold, the kind of morning where your breath hangs in the air like prayers you can see. I woke before 5, not from habit this time, but from the restless energy of a man who'd finally stopped pretending he didn't have a fight on his hands. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with Margaret's address book. the small leather one where she'd kept contact information for everyone who mattered. Her handwriting filled the pages in blue ink. Neighbors, friends, family, professionals. Near the back, under L, I found what I was looking for. Lucas Brennan, attorney at law. Lucas had handled our real estate transactions, our wills, the business incorporation paperwork when I'd expanded from 1 garage to 3. More importantly, he'd been Margaret's friend since high school, the kind of man who still sent handwritten Christmas cards and remembered the names of your pets. I called him at home, knowing he'd be up early on Christmas morning with his grandchildren. "Richard," his voice carried surprise and concern. "Everything all right?" "I need a professional opinion, Lucas, and maybe some help with a problem that can't wait until after the holidays." "Of course, what's going on?" I told him about the quitclaim deed I'd found, about the trust proposal at dinner, about the smart lock installation I'd avoided. Lucas listened without interrupting, the way lawyers do when they're calculating billable hours and legal strategies simultaneously. "Jesus, Richard, how long has this been building?" "Probably longer than I realized. Margaret always said I was too trusting when it came to family." "Margaret was a smart woman. Can you be at my office in an hour? I want to see those documents you found." Lucas's office occupied the 2nd floor of a brick building downtown, above the pharmacy where Margaret used to get her prescriptions filled. The waiting room smelled like old leather and fresh coffee, decorated with photographs of local landmarks from 50 years ago when the world moved slower and handshake deals still meant something. Lucas looked older than the last time I'd seen him, thinner, grayer, wearing the kind of wool cardigan that successful men put on when they stop caring about impressing anyone. But his eyes were sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses, and his handshake was firm. "Show me what you found." I spread the documents across his mahogany desk. The blank quitclaim deed, the financial planning folder, Patricia's email about property consolidation and access controls. Lucas studied each paper with the methodical attention of a man who'd spent 40 years reading between the lines of other people's intentions. "This is sophisticated," he said finally. "Whoever's advising them knows what they're doing. The quitclaim deed is just a draft, so nothing criminal yet. But combined with the trust proposal and the smart home integration," he tapped Patricia's email with his pen. "They're building a framework for control." "What kind of control?" "Think about it. You transfer your property into a family trust with David as co-trustee. You install smart locks that can be controlled remotely. Suddenly, every decision about your home, who enters, who leaves, when the locks engage, becomes a family decision. And if they can establish any concerns about your capacity to make decisions." The implication hung in the air between us like smoke. I'd seen it happen to other men my age. A moment of confusion, a forgotten appointment, a bill paid twice by accident. Suddenly, family members were talking to doctors about competency evaluations and guardianship proceedings. "What can I do?" Lucas leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "Several things. First, we need to make sure your existing estate planning is bulletproof. Updated will, healthcare directives, powers of attorney that specifically name who you want making decisions if you ever can't make them yourself." "Not David." "Not necessarily. You could name me or another neutral party, someone whose only interest is following your wishes." He pulled a yellow legal pad from his desk drawer and began making notes. "Second, we document everything. Every conversation, every attempt to pressure you, every unauthorized access to your documents. Build a paper trail that shows a pattern of behavior." "And third?" "Third, we get creative. If they want to play games with property ownership and access control, we play those games better than they do." Lucas spent the next hour explaining options I'd never considered. Revocable living trusts that I could change at will. Transfer on death deeds that would bypass probate entirely. Life estates that would let me live in my house until I died, while ensuring it went exactly where I wanted it to go afterward. "The beautiful thing about these instruments," he said, "is that they're completely legal, completely ethical, and completely under your control. Your son can advise you all he wants, but he can't force you to sign anything." "What about the smart locks?" Lucas smiled, the expression of a man who'd outmaneuvered younger, less experienced opponents more times than he could count. "That's where we get really creative. Did you know that smart home systems can be programmed with multiple user levels? Owner, family, guest, service provider, each with different access privileges? I didn't know that, but I was beginning to understand where this was going. If someone installs a smart lock system on your property without your explicit consent, that could be considered trespassing or destruction of property. But if you were to install your own system with your own programming, he shrugged. Well, that's just a homeowner taking advantage of modern technology. We spent another hour going through details. Lucas would file the necessary paperwork to update my estate planning by the end of the week. He'd research smart home systems and recommend an installer who worked exclusively for me, not for anyone claiming to represent my interests. And he'd begin documenting everything David and Jennifer had done so far. One more thing, he said as I prepared to leave. This neighbor of yours who understands technology, you mentioned him earlier. What's his name? Pete Sullivan, retired engineer, lives 2 houses down. Bring him in on this. If David's planning something with smart home technology, having our own expert could be invaluable. I drove home through empty Christmas Day streets, past houses where families were gathered around trees and dinner tables, celebrating traditions that had been passed down through generations without lawyers or trust documents or access control systems. Normal families who didn't need to lawyer up just to keep their own children from stealing their homes. Pete Sullivan answered his door wearing a Christmas sweater that had definitely been a gift from someone who loved him, but didn't understand his sense of style. Behind him, I could hear the chaos of grandchildren and the smell of turkey in the oven. Richard, Merry Christmas. Everything okay? I need a favor, Pete. Professional consultation. I'll pay your hourly rate. Pete's eyebrows rose. For 30 years, our relationship had been purely neighborly. Borrowed tools, shared coffee, the occasional conversation over the fence. But before retirement, he'd been the kind of engineer who designed security systems for corporate headquarters and government buildings. What kind of consultation? I explained about the smart lock installation, about David's sudden interest in my home security, about the feeling that technology was being used as a weapon against me rather than a tool for my benefit. Pete listened with the intense focus of a man who understood that technology was never neutral. It always served someone's interests, and the question was whose. Interesting problem, he said finally. Can I ask you something? Do you actually want smart home technology, or do you just want to make sure nobody else controls it? The question was more perceptive than I'd expected. Both, I think. If it's coming, whether I want it or not, I'd rather be in charge of it. Smart answer. Give me until tomorrow to research current systems. I'll put together a proposal that gives you everything your son wants to install, plus a few features he probably hasn't thought of. What kind of features? Pete's smile was the expression of a man who had spent his career staying one step ahead of people who thought they were smarter than him. Let's just say that modern security systems can be very educational. You'd be amazed what you can learn about people's comings and goings when you have the right monitoring capabilities. That evening, I sat in Margaret's chair and looked at our Christmas tree, thinking about the conversation I'd had with Lucas and the proposal Pete was developing. For the first time since this whole mess started, I felt like I was playing offense instead of defense. My phone rang at 8 o'clock, David's number again. Dad, I wanted to apologize for last night. I think we came on too strong. You think? Look, forget about the trust stuff for now. Forget about the lawyer. But the smart lock installation, that's just practical security, especially after what happened to the Hendersons last month. The Hendersons. Our neighbors 3 blocks over who'd been burglarized while visiting family for Thanksgiving. It was a nice touch, using real neighborhood crime to justify his proposal. I can handle my own security, David. I know you can, but why not take advantage of modern technology? The installer can come back tomorrow, get everything set up in an hour. No paperwork, no complications, just better locks. I looked at the notes I'd taken during my meeting with Lucas. Document everything, build a paper trail, get ahead of their strategy instead of reacting to it. Actually, I've been thinking about that. You're right, smart locks are a good idea. I've already contacted a company about installation. Silence on David's end. This wasn't the response he'd expected. Oh, well, that's great. Which company? Local firm. Pete Sullivan recommended them, should have everything set up by New Year's. Dad, the company I found offers really competitive pricing, and they specialize in family integrated systems. Family integrated systems. I wondered if he could hear how that sounded, like technology designed to give families control over individual members rather than the other way around. I appreciate the offer, but I've already made arrangements. Another silence. Then, okay, well, I hope you'll show me how it works when you get it installed. Of course. After I hung up, I called Pete and left a message. Timelines moved up. I need that proposal by tomorrow. Then I poured myself a small glass of the bourbon David had given me for my birthday, the only Christmas present I'd received this year, and toasted Margaret's photograph on the mantel. I think I'm finally learning to fight back, I told her image. Hope you approve. Outside, snow had begun to fall, dusting the world with the kind of clean white silence that made everything look peaceful. But I knew better now. I'd learned that beneath the surface of family gatherings and holiday traditions and well-meaning advice, people were capable of remarkable cruelty when they wanted something badly enough. The question was, what did David want badly enough to lie to me, manipulate me, and plan to control my own home without my permission? I had a feeling I was about to find out. Pete Sullivan arrived at my house the morning after Christmas carrying a laptop bag and wearing the focused expression of a man with a mission. Snow dusted his shoulders and clung to his gray beard, making him look like a particularly tech-savvy Santa Claus. I've been up all night researching this, he said, stamping snow off his boots in my entryway. Your son's people were planning something sophisticated. Good thing you called me when you did. We sat at my kitchen table while Pete opened his laptop and pulled up what looked like architectural blueprints of my house. Detailed floor plans showing every door, window, and electrical outlet. How did you get these? County records, building permits from when you renovated the kitchen 10 years ago. Amazing what's available online if you know where to look. He traced a finger along the diagram. Now, here's what a standard smart home installation would look like. Door locks, obviously, but also window sensors, motion detectors, cameras, environmental controls, the works. That's more than David mentioned. Of course it is. The smart lock is just the entry point. Once you have the infrastructure in place, adding new components is simple. And here's the thing. Pete clicked to another screen showing a complex network diagram. Modern systems are designed around the concept of centralized control, one master account that can override all other users. The implications were clear. Whoever set up the system would be the master user. Everyone else, including the homeowner, would have subordinate access. Can we prevent that? Better than prevent it, we can reverse it. Pete's smile was predatory. I've designed a system that gives you capabilities your son probably hasn't imagined. Full monitoring, remote access, audit trails of every interaction, plus a few special features. What kind of special features? Pete pulled out a folder filled with technical specifications and installation diagrams. Motion sensors that can differentiate between authorized and unauthorized personnel. Cameras with facial recognition tied to your approved user database, audio recording capabilities in every room, and my personal favorite, geofencing. Geofencing? The system tracks the location of registered mobile devices. So, if someone with a key to your house approaches while you're not home, you get an alert. If they enter without permission, you get video, audio, and a complete record of their activities. I studied the specifications, trying to process the scope of what Pete was proposing. This is surveillance. This is protection. Your son wants to use technology to control your environment. I'm suggesting you use technology to control the people who want to control your environment. The distinction was subtle, but important. David's approach assumed I needed to be managed. Pete's approach assumed I was capable of managing others. How quickly can you install this? I've got a crew standing by. We can have everything operational by tomorrow night. But, Richard, you need to understand. Once this system is active, you'll know things about your family that you might not want to know. I already know things about my family I don't want to know. Pete nodded slowly. Fair enough? There's one more component we should discuss. Emergency protocols. What kind of emergencies? The kind where someone tries to use your own security system against you. Forced entry, coerced access codes, attempts to override the system from outside. I've built in some safeguards that would make it very difficult for anyone to lock you out of your own house. The phrase lock you out of your own house hit harder than it should have, because that's exactly what David and Jennifer were planning, wasn't it? Not physically, maybe, but legally, financially, practically. Death by 1,000 small controls until I became a guest in my own life. Do it, I said. All of it. Pete's crew arrived that afternoon. 3 men who worked with the quiet efficiency of people who specialized in security installations for clients who valued discretion. They moved through my house like ghosts, drilling holes, running cables, mounting devices so small I could barely see them. The lead installer, a soft-spoken man named Marcus, showed me the control interface on a tablet that looked deceptively simple. Everything's operated through this app, he explained. Armed, disarmed, monitoring, playback. Mr. Sullivan has programmed multiple user levels, but you're the only one with administrator access. What about family members? They can have guest access if you choose to grant it. Limited permissions, time restricted, and you can revoke it at any time. By evening, my house had been transformed into something that looked identical, but functioned completely differently. Cameras disguised as smoke detectors, motion sensors hidden in light fixtures, door locks that looked traditional but could be controlled remotely. The whole system connected to a central hub hidden in my basement, recording everything, monitoring everything, protecting everything. Test it, Pete said, handing me the control tablet. I armed the system and walked outside. Immediately, my phone buzzed with an alert. Motion detected, front porch, authorized user, Richard Dalton. When I re-entered the house, another alert. Entry detected, front door. User authenticated via facial recognition. Now try the guest access feature, Pete suggested. I programmed a temporary code and gave it to Pete. When he tried to enter, the system recognized him as an unauthorized user attempting access. My phone showed his photograph, the exact time of entry, and options to approve, deny, or monitor his activities. Impressive? That's nothing. Watch this. Pete pulled out his own phone and showed me an app interface. As the system designer, I have diagnostic access. I can monitor system health, troubleshoot problems, update software. But I can't control any functions, can't unlock doors, can't disable monitoring, can't access recorded data. Only you can do that. It was the difference between having a key to someone's house and having the deed to the property. What happens if David shows up with his locksmith? Try it and see. I used the tablet to simulate an unauthorized entry attempt. Immediately, every light in the house began flashing in a specific pattern. Not an alarm, but a clear signal that something was wrong. My phone erupted with alerts, and somewhere in the basement, I could hear the quiet hum of recording equipment capturing everything. The system's learning, Pete explained. Every interaction creates data, patterns of behavior, times of access, duration of visits. After a few weeks, it'll be able to tell you things about your visitors that they probably don't know about themselves. That night, I sat in Margaret's chair with the control tablet in my lap, watching camera feeds from every room in my house. It felt strange, seeing my own life from this perspective, the quiet routine of a widowed man moving through spaces that held 40 years of memories. But it also felt powerful. For the first time since David had started talking about optimization and protection and family trusts, I was the one with information. I was the one with control. My phone rang at 9:30. David again. Dad, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about installing your own security system. What about it? Well, I'd love to see what you chose. Maybe I could stop by tomorrow, take a look. Of course, come anytime. Great, I'll bring Jennifer. She's really interested in home automation. After I hung up, I opened the system's administrative panel and created 2 guest profiles, David Dalton and Jennifer Dalton, limited access, monitoring enabled. All activities logged. Then I called Lucas Brennan. The system's installed, I told him. Tomorrow we find out what David's really planning. Be careful, Richard. Once you start collecting evidence, you can't unknow what you learn. I'm not sure I have a choice anymore. No, Lucas said quietly. I suppose you don't. I spent the evening reviewing the system's capabilities, learning the interface, understanding the extent of what Pete had built for me. It was more than security. It was intelligence gathering, the ability to see not just what people did in my house, but when they did it, how long they stayed, what rooms they visited, what they said when they thought no one was listening. Margaret's photograph smiled down at me from the mantel, and I wondered what she would think of all this technology, all this surveillance, all this electronic armor I'd wrapped around our home. She'd always believed in trusting people until they gave you reason not to. But David had given me reasons, multiple reasons. And tomorrow, I suspected, he'd give me more. The tablet chimed softly with a system status update. All zones secure, monitoring active, user authenticated, Richard Dalton. For the first time in weeks, I felt truly secure in my own house. Not because of the locks or cameras or sensors, but because I was finally fighting back with weapons more sophisticated than my son had anticipated. The war for control of my life was about to escalate, but this time, I'd be the one choosing the battlefield. I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, leaving the system to watch over my house while I slept. In the basement, hard drives spun quietly, collecting data, building patterns, preparing to reveal whatever secrets my family thought they could keep from me. Tomorrow would be very educational for all of us. They arrived at 10:15 the next morning, just late enough to suggest they weren't eager for this visit but had committed to it. Through the kitchen window, I watched David park his car in the driveway with unusual care, backing up twice to get the angle exactly right. Jennifer sat in the passenger seat for a long moment after the engine shut off, applying lipstick in the mirror with the precision of someone preparing for battle. My tablet chimed softly. Motion detected. Driveway. 2 unauthorized vehicles approaching. The system had cataloged every car that regularly visited my house. David's sedan wasn't on the approved list. I opened the front door before they could knock, the same way I'd always done. But now I knew the system was recording everything. Their faces, their voices, their exact time of arrival. Dad, David's smile seemed forced, like he was working harder than usual to appear relaxed. Thanks for agreeing to show us the new security setup. Of course, come in. Jennifer kissed my cheek, her perfume sharp in the cold air. This is so exciting, Richard. David's told me all about your decision to modernize. Modernize. As if my 72 years of managing my own affairs had been some kind of extended childhood that I was finally outgrowing. They followed me into the living room, both of them scanning the space with obvious curiosity. The beauty of Pete's installation was its invisibility. Everything looked exactly as it always had. The cameras were hidden in smoke detectors and light fixtures. The motion sensors looked like standard home security equipment. The door locks appeared completely traditional from the inside. So where is it? David asked. The control panel? I pulled out the tablet Pete had configured for me. Everything runs through this. Jennifer's eyes widened. Wow, that's much more sophisticated than I expected. Can you show us how it works? I demonstrated the basic functions, arming and disarming the system, checking door locks, viewing camera feeds. But I didn't show them the administrative controls, the user management system, or the recording capabilities. Those features were need to know, and they didn't need to know. This is impressive, David said, studying the tablet screen. Much more advanced than the system I was researching. What company did you use? Local installer. Pete Sullivan recommended them. Pete Sullivan. David's tone carried a note of something I couldn't quite identify. Surprise, concern. I didn't know he was into home security. He's not, but he understands technology, and he understands people who try to use technology against other people. The words hung in the air between us. Jennifer glanced at David, some silent communication passing between them. My tablet chimed again. Audio threshold exceeded. Living room. The system had detected elevated stress levels in their voices. Dad, David said carefully, I hope you're not still upset about Christmas Eve dinner. We really were just trying to help. I know what you were trying to do. Good. Then you understand that everything we suggested was in your best interest. I looked at my son, really looked at him. At 43, he had Margaret's eyes, but none of her warmth. His success in business had given him confidence, but it had also given him something else. The assumption that success in one area qualified him to manage all areas of everyone else's life. David, can I ask you something? Of course. When did you start thinking of me as a problem that needed solving? The question caught him off guard. His careful composure slipped for just a moment, revealing something raw underneath. I don't think of you as a problem. No, Then why the secret meetings with lawyers? Why the quitclaim deed I found in the lake house file cabinet? Why the smart lock installation scheduled without my permission? Jennifer's face went pale. David's jaw tightened in the way it had when he was a teenager caught in a lie. You went through my papers? I went through my papers, in my file cabinet, in my lake house, the papers you'd added without asking. Dad, I can explain. I'm sure you can. You've always been good with explanations. What I want to understand is the why. Why do you need control of my property? Why do you need access to my home? Why do you need me to be dependent on your decisions? David stood and walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back. When he turned around, his expression was different, harder, more determined. Because you're not thinking clearly anymore. The words hit like a physical blow. Excuse me? The isolation, the refusal to consider practical arrangements, the paranoia about family members trying to help you. These aren't the decisions of someone who's thinking rationally. Jennifer nodded supportively. We've been worried about you for months, Richard. The way you've withdrawn from family gatherings, the resistance to sensible suggestions about estate planning. And you think that gives you the right to make decisions for me? We think it gives us the responsibility to make sure you're protected, David said. Even if you don't agree with the protection. There it was. The core of their strategy laid bare. Paint me as incompetent, then step in as concerned family members forced to take control for my own good. It was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. Protected from what? From making decisions you'll regret, from people who might take advantage of your isolation, from the consequences of stubbornness. I picked up the tablet and touched the screen. Immediately, every smart lock in the house engaged with a soft clicking sound. David and Jennifer looked around, startled. What did you just do? Demonstrated that I understand technology well enough to control who enters and leaves my house. I touched the screen again, and the locks disengaged. Your locksmith can't override that. Your lawyers can't challenge it. Your concerned family meetings can't vote on it. David's composure finally cracked completely. Dad, you're making a mistake. We're not your enemies. Aren't you? You've researched ways to transfer my property without my knowledge. You've scheduled installations of equipment I didn't authorize. You've held meetings about my life without inviting me to participate. What would you call that? Love, Jennifer said quietly. We call that love. The word sat in the room like a lie too obvious to ignore. I thought about love, real love, the kind Margaret and I had shared for 45 years. Love that respected autonomy. Love that asked permission before making changes. Love that trusted the beloved to make their own decisions, even when those decisions seemed wrong. Love doesn't require control, I said. Love doesn't require deception. And love sure as hell doesn't require lawyers. My tablet chimed. Motion detected. Basement access. Someone else was in the house. I looked at the screen. A man in coveralls was descending the basement stairs, carrying what looked like electronic equipment. Through the audio feed, I could hear him talking on a phone. Yeah, I'm in. Give me 10 minutes to locate the hub. David, I said quietly, did you bring someone else with you today? His face went carefully blank. What do you mean? I turned the tablet screen toward them. On it, the basement camera showed the intruder examining the central hub of my security system, looking for ways to disable it. I mean the man in my basement who's trying to sabotage my security system while you keep me distracted up here. Jennifer's hand flew to her mouth. David looked like he was calculating whether to continue lying or switch to a different strategy. Dad, that's just a technician. We thought if we could get your system integrated with ours. Our system? You don't live here? The family system. Shared monitoring, centralized controls. It would be more efficient. More efficient. For them. I touched the tablet screen again. This time, the house alarm system activated. Not the shrill shriek of a break-in alarm, but a steady, authoritative tone that meant business. In the basement, the intruder looked up at the camera, clearly startled. You have 30 seconds to get him out of my house, I said, before I call the police and have him arrested for breaking and entering. David pulled out his phone and made a quick call. Through the tablet, I watched the man in the basement gather his tools and head for the stairs. This isn't over, David said as they prepared to leave. Yes, it is. I walked to the front door and held it open. The next time you want to discuss my living arrangements, my property, or my mental capacity, you can do it through lawyers, because as of right now, you're no longer welcome in this house without an invitation. Dad, please. Goodbye, David. They left without another word. I watched through the front window as they stood in the driveway for several minutes, having what looked like an intense conversation. The man in coveralls emerged from the side yard and joined them, shaking his head and pointing toward the house. Finally, they drove away. I sat in Margaret's chair and reviewed the tablet's recorded data from their visit. Audio files of their conversation about my mental state, video evidence of the unauthorized basement entry, timestamps showing the coordination between the distraction upstairs and the sabotage attempt downstairs. Everything documented, everything preserved, everything admissible in court if it came to that. My phone rang 20 minutes later. Lucas Brennan. Richard, I just got an interesting call from a lawyer named Caldwell. He's representing your son in what he calls a family matter requiring immediate attention. What kind of attention? He's filing for an emergency guardianship hearing, claims you're suffering from paranoid delusions, and may be a danger to yourself. I looked at the tablet in my hands, at the recorded evidence of everything that had just happened. How quickly can we respond? Fast. But Richard, you need to understand what you're in for. Guardianship proceedings are ugly. They'll question every decision you've made, every conversation you've had, every aspect of your mental state. They'll bring in doctors, psychologists, family members who'll testify about your declining capacity. Let them try. You sound confident. I am confident. They think they're fighting a confused old man who doesn't understand technology. They're wrong on all counts. After I hung up, I called Pete Sullivan. Pete, how's that audit trail function working? Perfectly. Why? Because I think we're about to find out just how educational modern security systems can be. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with 3 folders in front of me. The first contained Lucas's legal strategies for fighting the guardianship petition. The second held Pete's technical documentation of every security breach attempt, every unauthorized access, every attempt to override my system. The third folder was new, printouts of financial records I'd requested from my bank, showing unusual activity in accounts David had access to. Large withdrawals, transfers to accounts I didn't recognize. A pattern of spending that suggested my son's interest in my property might be more urgent than simple family concern. He wasn't just trying to control my life, he was trying to solve his own problems with my assets. The war was escalating exactly as I'd expected. But this time, I was ready. I opened Margaret's recipe box and found the card for her Christmas cookies, the ones she'd made every December for 40 years. Tomorrow, I'd bake a batch and take them to Lucas's office, because some traditions were worth preserving, even in the middle of a fight. Especially in the middle of a fight. The guardianship hearing was scheduled for January 15th, 3 weeks that passed like a slow-motion avalanche, each day bringing new legal documents, new accusations, new attempts to paint me as a man whose mind had betrayed him. Caldwell was thorough. I had to give him that. He'd assembled a case that looked compelling on paper. Isolated widower, refusing family help, installing excessive security systems, showing signs of paranoid behavior. He'd even found a psychologist willing to testify that my resistance to reasonable family assistance indicated cognitive decline. But Lucas was thorough too, and he had something Caldwell didn't. The truth, backed by technology that recorded everything. The hearing room was smaller than I'd expected, more like a conference room than a courtroom. Judge Patricia Morrison, no relation to Jennifer's mother, sat behind a modest desk, reading through the case files with the expression of someone who'd seen too many families tear themselves apart over money and pride. David sat with Caldwell at one table, wearing his best suit and an expression of sorrowful concern. Jennifer was beside him, tissues ready, prepared to testify about my declining mental state. Behind them, Patricia Monroe had positioned herself like a matriarch overseeing justice. I sat with Lucas at the opposing table, a tablet loaded with 3 weeks' worth of evidence beside me. Mr. Caldwell, Judge Morrison said, please present your case. Caldwell stood and began his performance. He painted a picture of a deteriorating old man, isolated and suspicious, making irrational decisions about his safety and finances. He described my refusal to accept help as evidence of cognitive decline. He presented David as a loving son, forced to take drastic action to protect his father from his own poor judgment. Your Honor, Caldwell concluded, Mr. Dalton's recent behavior demonstrates a clear pattern of paranoid thinking and impaired decision-making. His family is simply trying to ensure his safety and well-being. Then it was Lucas's turn. Your Honor, Mr. Dalton's behavior has been entirely rational. He's been protecting himself from a coordinated attempt to gain control of his assets. I'd like to present evidence of that attempt. Lucas activated the projection system and began showing the recorded data from my security system. Video of the unauthorized basement entry, audio recordings of David and Jennifer discussing my mental state while their accomplice tried to disable my security equipment, documentation of the financial irregularities and accounts David had access to. The most damning evidence came from a recording made 3 days after their failed visit to my house. The system had captured David and Jennifer standing in my driveway, apparently unaware that my outdoor cameras were operational. Just need to wait for the hearing, David's voice came clearly through the courtroom speakers. Once we have guardianship, we can override all his security nonsense. And the properties, Jennifer's voice. Trust transfers immediately. The lake house alone should cover what we need for Dad's business loan. The main house we can leverage for Mom's medical bills. Dad's business loan, Mom's medical bills, Patricia's medical bills. They weren't just trying to protect me. They were trying to liquidate my assets to solve their own financial problems. Judge Morrison's expression didn't change, but she stopped taking notes and started paying closer attention. Lucas continued his presentation, methodically demolishing every claim Caldwell had made. The security system wasn't paranoid. It was necessary protection against documented intrusion attempts. My refusal to accept help wasn't irrational. It was an appropriate response to family members who had been planning to steal from me. Your Honor, Lucas concluded, Mr. Dalton isn't suffering from cognitive decline. He's suffering from family members who view him as a source of funding rather than a person deserving of respect. Caldwell tried to recover during cross-examination, suggesting that the recordings might be fabricated or taken out of context. But the technical logs were too detailed, the timestamps too precise, the pattern of behavior too consistent. Judge Morrison called a 15-minute recess. In the hallway, David approached me while our lawyers conferred near the water fountain. Dad, we can still work this out. Forget the guardianship. Forget the lawyers. Just, can't we go back to being a family? I looked at him for a long moment, this man who shared my DNA but no longer shared my values. David, I've been thinking about something your mother used to say. She said the worst thing about betrayal isn't that it hurts. It's that it comes from people you trusted enough to hurt you. I never meant to hurt you. I know. You meant to help yourself. That's what makes this so much worse. When we reconvened, Judge Morrison's decision was swift and unambiguous. Petition for guardianship denied. Mr. Dalton has demonstrated clear mental capacity and sound judgment. The evidence suggests that his defensive measures were appropriate responses to actual threats. Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for investigation of potential financial exploitation of an elderly person. David's face went white. Jennifer started crying. Patricia Monroe stood and walked out without a word. Caldwell gathered his papers with the efficient movements of a man who'd already moved on to his next case. Mr. Dalton, this isn't personal. I was just representing my client's interests. I understand, I said, just like I was representing mine. That afternoon, I drove to the lake house for the first time since Christmas. The January air was sharp and clean, the lake frozen except for a narrow channel where the creek fed into it. Ice fishermen had set up shanties near the far shore, small communities of patience and hope scattered across the white surface. Inside the cabin, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, thinking about what I wanted to say to my son. Because despite everything, the lies, the betrayal, the attempt to steal my property and control my life, he was still my son, still the boy I'd taught to fish from this dock, still the teenager I'd stayed up with when he couldn't sleep before college interviews. The letter took me 3 hours to write. I went through 4 drafts before I found the words that said everything I needed to say without saying more than he could hear. David, by the time you read this, the legal proceedings will be over. I hope you understand that I didn't fight the guardianship petition out of stubbornness or pride. I fought it because it was wrong, and because someone needed to demonstrate that actions have consequences. I've been thinking about the last conversation I had with your mother. She was worried about you, not your success or your marriage or your financial situation, but about the kind of man you were becoming. She saw something in you that reminded her of her own father, who'd been charming and successful and completely without principles when it came to money. I defended you then. I told her she was seeing problems that didn't exist, that you were just ambitious and driven. I was wrong and she was right. She was usually right about people. I want you to know that I understand why you did what you did. The business loan, Patricia's medical expenses, the pressure of maintaining a lifestyle you couldn't afford. These are real problems that required real solutions. What I can't understand is why you thought the solution was to lie to me, steal from me, and try to have me declared incompetent. We could have talked. I would have helped if you'd asked, but you didn't ask. You tried to take, and that's the difference between the son I raised and the man you've become. I'm making some changes to my estate planning. The house will eventually go to the Veterans Community Center, where it can serve a useful purpose. The lake house is being donated to the state park system, where families can enjoy it the way we used to. Your mother's jewelry and personal items are being held in trust for any grandchildren we might eventually have. You're still my son, and I still love you. But love doesn't mean enabling destructive behavior. It doesn't mean pretending that betrayal didn't happen. And it doesn't mean sacrificing my own dignity to make your life easier. If you want to rebuild our relationship, you'll need to start by acknowledging what you did wrong, not explaining it, not justifying it, not asking me to understand your position, acknowledging it, taking responsibility for your choices and their consequences. Until that happens, we have nothing more to discuss. Your father? I sealed the letter in an envelope and addressed it to David's house. Then I drove into town and mailed it from the post office, where Mrs. Henley had been working behind the counter for 30 years and still remembered when David used to come in with me to buy stamps for his baseball card orders. "Haven't seen that boy in years," she said, looking at the address. "How's he doing?" "Learning some hard lessons," I said. Sometimes that's the only way people grow up. Back at the lake house, I spent the rest of the afternoon organizing Margaret's things. Her books, arranged by author on shelves I'd built to her specifications. Her quilting supplies, still organized in the wooden cabinet she'd bought at an estate sale in Branson. Her collection of lake stones, smooth specimens she'd gathered during our evening walks, each one somehow special enough to bring home. I wasn't ready to give these things away, but I was ready to make decisions about them. The books would go to the library, the quilting supplies to the senior center, where other women could create beautiful things with thread and patience. The stones I'd keep, maybe arrange in the garden behind the house, where spring flowers would grow around them. As the sun set behind the bare trees, painting the frozen lake orange and gold, I called Lucas from the cabin phone. "It's done," I told him. "Letters mailed, estate planning documents are signed, property transfers are scheduled. How do you feel?" The question surprised me. In all the legal maneuvering and strategic planning, no one had asked how I felt about dismantling my family, about acknowledging that the son I'd raised had tried to steal from me, about choosing strangers over blood when it came to my legacy. "Free," I said finally. "For the first time in months, I feel free." That night, I built a fire in the cabin's stone fireplace and sat in Margaret's chair with a cup of tea, watching flames dance behind the glass doors. The cabin was quiet except for the settling of old wood and the distant sound of ice shifting on the lake. I thought about traditions and how they survived, not by staying exactly the same, but by adapting to serve the people who honored them. Christmas dinner would be different next year. I might spend it at the Veterans Center, serving meals to men who understood the cost of protecting what mattered. Or I might come here to the lake, where Margaret and I had always been happiest. My phone buzzed with a text message. Pete Sullivan. "System operating perfectly. All zones secure. Sleep well, neighbor." I smiled and typed back, "Thanks for everything." Then I turned off the phone and sat in the firelight, listening to my house breathe around me. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the lake and the trees and the roads that led away from this place. By morning, the world would look clean and new, ready for whatever came next. At midnight, the grandfather clock in the corner chimed 12 times, marking the end of one day and the beginning of another. I raised my teacup in a small salute to Margaret's photograph on the mantel. "I think you'd be proud," I told her image. I finally learned to fight back. The fire settled into embers, snow tapped gently against the windows, and somewhere in the distance an owl called across the frozen lake, its voice carrying the ancient wisdom of creatures who understood that survival sometimes required letting go of everything you thought you needed. I was finally free to discover what I actually wanted, and for the first time in 3 years, that felt like enough. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it the kind of warm March morning that makes you believe winter might actually end. I was in the garden behind the house, turning soil that had spent 4 months frozen solid, when I heard the familiar sound of gravel crunching in the driveway. Through the kitchen window, I watched David's car pull up. Not the expensive sedan he'd lost in the divorce, but a modest Honda with a few years on it. He sat behind the wheel for a moment, as had become his habit during our monthly coffee meetings, preparing himself for whatever conversation awaited. But this time was different. This time, he got out of the car carrying a small potted plant and wearing work clothes instead of business attire. "Dad," he approached the garden gate, holding the plant like an offering. "I brought something." I leaned on my shovel and studied the small ceramic pot in his hands. Inside, green shoots were just beginning to emerge from dark soil. "What is it?" "Tomato seedlings, Cherokee purples, Mom's favorite variety." He set the pot on the garden table Margaret had positioned to catch the morning sun. "I thought maybe, if you're planting a garden this year." I looked at the seedlings, then at my son. 5 months of careful conversations had brought us to this moment. Not trust exactly, but the possibility of trust. The willingness to share something that mattered instead of just talking about things that had gone wrong. "I was planning to stick with flowers this year, less maintenance." "I understand. If you don't want them..." I didn't say I didn't want them. I set the shovel aside and examined the plants more closely. Strong stems, healthy leaves, the promise of fruit that wouldn't ripen until late summer. "How did you know Cherokee purples were her favorite?" David's expression softened. "I helped her plant them the last summer before she got sick. She told me they were worth the extra work because nothing else tasted like home." He paused. I thought maybe it was time I started remembering the things that mattered instead of just the things that went wrong. We spent the morning working in the garden together, the first time we'd shared any kind of physical labor since David had helped me clean out the garage after Margaret's funeral. He was out of practice with manual work, his hands soft from years of office life, but he was determined. When he cut his finger on a rose thorn, he wrapped it in his handkerchief and kept working. "The Veterans Center," he said, as we planted the tomatoes in a sunny corner where Margaret had once grown herbs. "How's that going?" "Good. Better than good, actually. They've got 24 residents now, all of them getting back on their feet. The house is being used the way it was meant to be used, for people who need a place to belong. And you're okay with that? Seeing strangers living in the place where you and Mom raised me?" I considered the question while pressing soil around the base of a seedling. They're not strangers anymore, and the house isn't just being lived in. It's being honored. These men understand what it means to have a place to call home because they've gone without one. David nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about that, about the difference between having a house and having a home, about how I confused the two for so long." "What's the difference?" "A house is something you own. A home is something you belong to." He sat back on his heels, dirt under his fingernails, sweat on his forehead. "I spent so much time trying to own things that I forgot how to belong to anything." We worked until noon, then sat on the back porch with glasses of iced tea and sandwiches I'd made from bread that was a day too old, but still perfectly good. The kind of simple meal Margaret used to insist tasted better when shared with someone you cared about. "Dad," David said, setting down his glass, "I need to tell you something. I've been offered a job in Denver. Good company, decent salary, a chance to start over somewhere nobody knows about my mistakes." My chest tightened automatically. The old fear of being abandoned, of watching my son disappear into a life that didn't include me. But then I caught myself. This wasn't abandonment. This was a man making a decision about his own life, consulting with his father instead of excluding him. "What do you think you should do?" I think I should take it. The therapy is helping, but I need more than help. I need distance from the places and people that enabled my worst decisions, including this town. Including me? David shook his head. Especially not you. Dad, these past few months, learning to be honest with you, it's been the hardest and most important work I've ever done. I don't want to lose that. Then don't. It would mean our coffee meetings would have to be phone calls, and visits would be longer but less frequent. I thought about the monthly conversations that had slowly rebuilt the foundation of our relationship, about the careful honesty we'd learned to share, the trust we'd begun to reconstruct from nothing. Geography couldn't change that. Might even strengthen it by removing the temptation to fall back into old patterns. David, 5 years ago, I would have tried to talk you out of leaving, not because it was wrong for you, but because I was afraid of being alone. I looked out at the garden where Cherokee purple tomato plants were settling into soil that would nourish them through the growing season. But I'm not afraid of being alone anymore. I'm afraid of you making decisions based on what you think I need instead of what you know is right. Relief spread across his face like sunrise. So you think I should go? I think you should do what serves the man you're trying to become, not the man you're trying to stop being. We spent the afternoon talking about practical things, when he would leave, how often we would talk, plans for him to visit during holidays. Normal conversation between a father and son who would learn to discuss the future without trying to control it. As the sun began its descent toward the western tree line, David stood to leave. Dad, there's one more thing, something I've wanted to say for months but couldn't figure out how. Go ahead. I'm proud of you, for fighting back when I tried to steal from you, for refusing to let me treat you like a problem instead of a person, for teaching me that love doesn't mean letting people hurt you just because they're family. The words sat between us like a bridge, not spanning the entire distance we'd traveled, but connecting where we'd been to where we were going. And I'm proud of you for learning the difference between explaining your mistakes and excusing them. That's harder than most people realize. We shook hands at his car, the formal gesture that had marked every parting since our first coffee meeting. But this time, David pulled me into a quick hug. Brief, careful, but genuine. I'll call when I get to Denver. I'll be here. After he drove away, I walked through the house, checking the familiar routine of locks and lights and small acts of maintenance that kept a home functioning. The security system chimed its evening greeting. All zones secure. Good evening, Richard. But tonight the house didn't feel like a fortress protecting me from unwanted intrusion. It felt like what it had always been, a place where people who cared about each other could find safety and rest. In Margaret's chair, I opened the evening paper and read about ordinary problems affecting ordinary people, budget disputes at the city council, plans for a new traffic light at the dangerous intersection by the school, a fundraising drive for the volunteer fire department, the familiar rhythm of community life continuing its ancient patterns. My phone rang at 8 o'clock. Pete Sullivan. Richard, just wanted to let you know the system's working perfectly. All the monitoring equipment is functioning within normal parameters. Any unusual activity? Nothing worth mentioning. A delivery truck yesterday, the mailman this morning, a couple of kids cutting through the backyard on their way home from school. All normal, all harmless. Normal, harmless. The words felt like gifts. Pete, I've been thinking, this system you built for me, it's more than I need now. You want to scale it back? I want to simplify it, keep the basic security features, but remove the surveillance components. I don't need to monitor people anymore. I just need to keep them out if they don't belong. I can do that. Might even save you some money on the monthly monitoring fees. After we hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness and thought about the difference between being protected and being paranoid, between reasonable caution and excessive control. The system had served its purpose, protecting me when I needed protection, gathering evidence when I needed proof. But that chapter was over. I looked at Margaret's photograph on the mantel, her smile warm and knowing in the lamplight. I think we're going to be okay, I told her image. All of us, finally. Outside, the Cherokee purple tomato plants were settling into their new soil, sending roots deep into earth that would sustain them through the long, growing season ahead. By August, they would be heavy with fruit that tasted like the summers Margaret and I had shared in this garden, like the meals we'd prepared together in this kitchen. like the home we'd built with 45 years of small daily acts of love. Some traditions were worth preserving, some were worth rebuilding from scratch, and some were worth letting go so that new ones could take root. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9 times, marking another day in a life that had learned to measure time not in loss, but in possibility. Tomorrow I would work in the garden, call the Veterans Center about the upcoming fundraiser, maybe drive out to the lake house to check on the daffodils Margaret had planted 20 years ago. Simple plans for a simple life. But simplicity, I'd learned, was not the same as emptiness. It was clarity. It was choosing what mattered and releasing what didn't. It was enough, more than enough. It was exactly the life I'd chosen to build, from the pieces of the one I'd had to defend. And sitting in Margaret's chair, surrounded by the quiet contentment of a house that was finally completely my own, I knew that some fights, the right fights, fought for the right reasons, were worth whatever they cost. Even if the cost was everything you thought you couldn't live without. Even if what you discovered was that you could live with much less than you'd imagined and be happier for it. The tomatoes would ripen in their own time. David would find his way in Denver. The seasons would change as they always had. And I would be here, tending what needed tending, protecting what needed protecting, and learning, still learning, at 72, how to build a life that honored both the past and the future without being trapped by either. That was enough wisdom for one lifetime. Maybe even enough for two. If you want a different ending, type change.